Ms. Franke, how do you plead to count 1, aggravated child abuse, a second-degree felony?
Guilty.
To count 3, aggravated child abuse, a second-degree felony?
Guilty.
To count 5, aggravated child abuse, a second-degree felony?
Guilty.
With Ruby Franke pleading guilty in her child abuse case, what does that mean for the woman she's throwing under the bus, her co-defendant, Jodi Hildebrandt? KUTV2 News' Brian Schnee is back with us to talk about what we can expect. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. There are still so many questions in the Ruby Franke case out of Utah, and as our Sidebar followers know, we have been actively following the story since it broke over the summer. And now that Ruby Franke has officially pleaded guilty in her criminal case, what does that mean for her co-defendant, Jodi Hildebrandt? That is an important question. Now, do a little bit of a backup. Remember, Ruby Franke was the once infamous YouTuber. She started a popular channel called 8 Passengers with her husband, Kevin, back in 2015. It documented their lives as a couple with their 6 children. And Franke took a lot of heat for her controversial parenting techniques.
You can shift from victim, whether you're in denigrating or adulating victim. You have the power to shift out of it at any moment.
Now, at one point, Ruby ended up partnering up with a woman named Jodi Hildebrandt, who offered these life coaching services through this organization known as Connections. Ruby, in fact, was listed as a certified mental fitness trainer on the Connections website. They're working together. Then you fast forward to August of this year, and she and Hildebrandt are each arrested and each charged with 6 counts of aggravated child abuse of Franke's 2 young children who were staying at Hildebrandt's place. Her 12-year-old son managed to escape Hildebrandt's home, ran to a neighbor who called 911. The boy was reportedly emaciated with wounds and evidence that he'd been tied up. The boy's sister, who was 9 years old at the time, I believe she's 10 years old now, again, this is Ruby's daughter, reportedly found in the house in similar condition. She was taken to the hospital to be treated for malnourishment. And Ruby and Jodi, they were each charged with 6 counts of aggravated child abuse. And it was our understanding that each count carries a maximum of 15 years in prison. By the way, Kevin ended up filing for divorce from Ruby, and according to his lawyer, he had been living separately from her for over a year for her arrest. When I interviewed Kevin's attorney, he basically seemed to suggest that parenting techniques were maybe one reason for the separation. But then you fast forward to last Friday, and Franke's law firm indicates that she is going to enter into a formal plea deal, a formal plea agreement. They released a statement, and this statement was very illuminating, but there was one particular point I want to emphasize for purposes of our conversation today. It says, quote, Ruby Franke is a devoted mother and is also a woman committed to constant improvement. Initially, Ms. Franke believed that Jodi Hildebrandt had the insight to offer a path to continual improvement. Ms. Hildebrandt took advantage of this quest and twisted it into something heinous. Over an extended period, Ms. Hildebrandt systematically isolated Ruby Franke from her extended family, older children, and her husband, Kevin Franke. This prolonged isolation resulted in Ms. Franke being subjected to a distorted sense of morality, shaped by Miss Hildebrandt's influence. Okay, so really putting the blame in a big way on Jodi Hildebrandt. But then you go to Monday, December 18th, and Ruby Franke officially pled guilty in the 5th District Court in Washington County, Utah, in front of Judge John J. Walton. She pled guilty to 4 of the 6 charges, 4 counts of aggravated child abuse. Each are second-degree felonies.
Ms. Franke, how do you plead to count 1, aggravated child abuse, a second-degree felony?
Guilty.
To count 3, aggravated child abuse, a second-degree felony?
Guilty.
To count 5, aggravated child abuse, a second-degree felony?
Guilty.
And to count 6, aggravated child abuse, a second-degree felony?
With my deepest regret and sorrow for my family and my children, guilty.
Now, there is no agreed-upon sentence in this plea agreement. The judge will ultimately sentence Ruby Franke, and based on the way that I read the terms of this plea agreement, he has discretion. It seems that she could be sentenced to the maximum on each count, 15 years, and the sentences for each could run consecutively, meaning one after the other. Not necessarily saying that is what would happen, but it'll be interesting. And after reading what I read in this plea agreement, I wouldn't be surprised, though, if she's hit with significant prison time. Ruby admitted, and this is in the plea agreement, that she abused the children, such as kicking her son while wearing boots, holding his head underwater, cutting off his oxygen by covering his mouth and nose, tying him up with handcuffs, forcing him to stay outside in the sun during the summer months. This was over a 3-month span. He suffered significant sunburns. Her daughter faced similar treatment, and she was forced to run barefoot on dirt road. She suffered blisters and scabs. I mean, this is just truly unthinkable. This is horrible, horrible stuff. But she is also accused of indoctrinating the kids to believe that they were evil and that this was all for their own good, presumably with the help of Jodi Hildebrandt. And that brings me to the next part, because it states in this plea agreement that Franke agrees to testify against Jodi Hildebrandt.
But the plea terms are relatively simple. She pled guilty to 4 counts of aggravated child abuse. The state agreed to dismiss the 2 other counts of child abuse. And she agreed to serve a prison term, and that the term for the 4 different counts will run consecutively and not concurrently. And she agrees, I'll read this one verbatim. She agrees to testify truthfully against Jodi Hildebrandt, and in return, the Washington County Attorney's Office agrees to remain neutral regarding future hearings before the Utah Board of Pardons.
That was the prosecutor outside of court when this happened. So what does all of this mean for Jodi Hildebrandt? Well, I had an opportunity to sit down with Brian Schnee, anchor and reporter for KUTV2 News out of Utah, who has been actively following this case, to talk about what all of this means for Jodi. Now, here's a warning. I actually interviewed him before Ruby Franke's court appearance. He was actually outside the courtroom or courthouse when we were speaking. So just to give you an idea, what we're talking about is before she officially pled guilty, before we saw this plea deal, we saw the details of this plea agreement. So just keep that in mind. But here you go. Ryan, good to see you. First, let everybody know where you are right now at the time of this recording.
Right now in St. George, Utah, as Ruby Franke goes into court here in just a few hours at the time of our conversation. So what's interesting about this case is Ruby's rooted in northern Utah. We are in southern Utah, which is where Jodi Hildebrandt's home is. So we're about 25, 30 minutes from Ivins, which is where all of this went down months ago now. But Ruby and Jodi have been held here locally, about 10 minutes from where I'm sitting at Purgatory Correctional Facility. So Ruby Franke's waiver hearing is today, and that's why we are here and we'll be in court for that.
Now, let's be entirely clear about this. The reason you and I had this conversation, I think it was about a week ago, maybe a week and a half ago, the terrific reporting from your team is what first broke it for us about this waiver hearing. And we were talking about, well, what could be a waiver hearing? And we know that a waiver hearing was essentially waiving a preliminary hearing. And could it be that they just, from a legal point of view, didn't want that hearing to be broadcast? Was there another consideration? Or could it possibly be that a plea has been entered or a plea is being negotiated? We talked about this. So the fact that we got this seeming confirmation from her law firm with that statement, what was your reaction to it?
Not surprised based on the initial, email I got from them a few weeks ago saying that they were hoping to reach a resolution shortly. I think it's interesting because you have to let the process, play itself out, as you know, Jesse. So it was really interesting to see that all of the things that we talked about in terms of a potential plea actually coming to fruition today, where they're expecting to, defense and prosecution come together and ultimately have this plea agreement. And I'm told that the court proceedings today should be relatively quick. That's not to say some of the things that will come out today could be particularly heinous or really tough for some people to process at home.
Now, again, I'm teasing up because we haven't even gotten into what this means for Jodi Hildebrandt. I want to get there in a minute, but I first want to talk about this statement because you and I haven't had a chance to talk about it. I read you a portion of it, which I think when we're talking about Jodi Hildebrandt, it's the most essential part. Throwing her under the bus, putting the blame on her. Now, what is your reaction to that part? Because, there's one thing for her to take a deal and plead guilty, essentially, to her crimes. But to put the blame on Jodi Hildebrandt, that was something. What'd you make of it?
I guess I'm not surprised because based on a lot of our reporting over the last few months, the people that we have spoken to had similar stories about Jodi Hildebrandt: manipulation, isolation, separating of couples as it pertains to ripping apart marriages. That is, in essence, if you look at the timeline, that happened to Ruby Franke too. Kevin filed for divorce. And then obviously there's the other parts down the line where it happened to do with whatever is involved in this child abuse portion, which apparently, depending on how you look into these things, a lot of people have looked at the YouTube videos over the years and said, hey, some things didn't seem right even before Ruby met Jodi. However, over the last 3 years or so, isolation from family, isolation from Kevin Franke, isolation, and then other tactics with children. A lot of that is in line with what we've heard about Jodi Hildebrandt for more than a decade now.
I mean, we did a sidebar on this over the weekend when the news broke, and I was playing a few clips from Jesse Hildebrandt, our interview with Jesse, who is Jodi Hildebrandt's niece, and those themes of isolation, manipulation, control were so consistent with that statement from Ruby Franke's law firm. I, too, wasn't surprised. But from a legal point of view, it's so interesting because I don't know how effective that would have been if they both went to trial together. If, throwing Jodi under the bus, because there was an aspect of the charges that that Ruby faces, that as long as you knew about the abuse and you allowed it to happen, you yourself could be convicted. So I didn't think, Brian, I'm not surprised hearing this. But I'm also not surprised that this is no longer, we're seemingly no longer going to trial, because that wouldn't have been a successful argument.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And based on the conversation you've had with Jesse Hildebrandt, and I have also had with her as well, a lot of these things line up. Now, Jesse was, a teenager at the time of her allegations of abuse, running away from Jodi Hildebrandt, basically not having a very sustainable time living with her for almost a year after being sent there by her parents, thinking this was the right way and the right course of action to maybe, quote unquote, correct her in some way. So it's kind of interesting. And I think that, coming out of that statement, we do see some admission of guilt, right? It's sprinkled in there of,
Some.
Right. It's accepting responsibility and certain things, to which we understand that there will obviously be charges today that will be discussed. Do we see all six? Probably not. Obviously, based on the deal, I would imagine not the case. But it is one of those things that most of that statement does point the finger at Jodi Hildebrandt, which, consistent with a lot of our reporting, in a way makes a lot of sense that somebody was in a way manipulated and kind of roped into this sort of thing. Now, that doesn't mean not accepting any responsibility for the actions, which I don't necessarily think they're not trying to do, but the 3/4 of that or 5/6 of that statement is indeed pointing the finger at Jodi Hildebrandt, saying, hey, look what she made me do, right?
Right.
Or look how this all worked out.
And from a legal point of view, I'm not surprised there's clear admission of guilt, because the deal hasn't been entered. Deals can blow up, and you don't want to say something. You have to be very careful with what your attorneys say prior to a plea deal actually being accepted by the court. It has to be accepted. So they don't want to make a blanket admission until they get that plea agreement, final down and ultimately written up. All right, Brian, actually, hold on for a second, because we're going to get back to talking about Jodi Hildebrandt, and there's a lot more to talk about. But we all know how much these cases really emphasize how scary the world can be and how unsafe it can be. That's why I wanted to take a minute to talk about our sponsor of this video, Morgan & Morgan. They have just been an incredible partner of ours. And the reason that I want to talk about them now is because one of the scariest things in life is when you get hurt and you don't know what to do. So Morgan & Morgan is actually the largest injury law firm in America. And in a time when you already would have so much to think about, they make it super easy for you. They have completely modernized the process, because you submit your claim, you sign contracts, you upload documents, and you talk to your whole legal team all on your phone. That's it. An attorney is going to review your case in just 8 clicks. They have 4,000 support staff that can help you too, which is just amazing to think about. And in terms of price, you only pay them if you win. There's no upfront fee. So if you're injured and you want to join the over 3 million people that call them every year, you can submit a claim at www.forthepeople.com/LC Sidebar, or by dialing #law. That's #529 on your phone. Now, let me just ask you what the main question is. What does this mean for Jodi Hildebrandt? The last time you and I spoke is she has a separate waiver hearing. What is the latest that you have heard with respect after Ruby's law firm has come forward with this statement? She's about to seemingly enter a plea deal, plead guilty. What does this mean for Jodi Hildebrandt?
Well, this means there's a lot more heat on Jodi, but maybe it does play in Ruby's favor that her hearing is first, right? And all of this is coming out first. The statement points towards Jodi. There's about 10 days between the two different hearings, and I still have yet to hear back from Jodi's representation, which I haven't since the very beginning of all of this. I mean, we have tried to at least get an inkling of how are they perceiving things. Compared to Ruby's attorneys, they have at least replied to some of our inquiries, and we've had conversations, and we have looked to this day, which is where we ultimately got the language in their statement first to be able to share with everybody. But it was one of those things that I'm still waiting to hear from the person representing Jodi Hildebrandt where they stand in all of this, because today has a big effect on what happens 10 days from now. And it would be really interesting to see how they are processing this whole thing. To which, again, at the time of you and I talking here, I did reach out again this morning just to say, hey, I'm in town here. I would love to get a little perspective from you about where things are right now. But it's been relatively silent. And as you and I have talked about, most of this, with the exception of the first 15 days or so, after all of this happened in late August, and then their initial appearance in early September, went really quiet, right? All we were hearing were people coming out of the woodwork, select family members, people that had experiences, mostly with Jodi, by the way, that you really hadn't heard much other than having to assume that both sides are looking at the discovery from the prosecution and they're going to come together and likely strike a deal, because it didn't look like they were going to move forward to push towards trial at this point. And it doesn't seem that way for Jodi either.
So you think there's a strong possibility that if let's say December 27th actually stays, that Jodi Hildebrandt would actually plead guilty as well? Because you have to imagine if she doesn't, Ruby Franke could potentially be a huge witness against her. For me, one of the things that I'm thinking about as well, the kids would have had to testify at a trial. And I think that's a major consideration for why Ruby Franke pled guilty. That's why I also think prosecutors might be open to accepting some sort of deal for Jodi Hildebrandt to make sure that these kids don't have to testify at an upcoming trial. But you tell me, do you think it's likely, whether or not that hearing stays, whether or not the hearing is delayed? I mean, this is a very big development. You think it's potentially likely Jodi Hildebrandt could plead guilty herself?
As an educated guess, based on what we're seeing, I do believe that what we're seeing with Ruby could very well happen with Jodi. And I do think a lot of it lies on the kids. They have been very careful with how the children have been treated through this entire thing, which I've been trying to be totally respectful of, because I understand. I mean, a new dad myself, the last thing I'd want is for my daughter to be roped into any of these things, right? If it ever came to that point, you don't want to provide any further harm towards these children than they've already been thrust into the spotlight. And you've already heard about the emaciation for two of the children, the horrific 911 call from the neighbor saying, hey, I just came across this kid who had ties around his wrists and his ankles. Having any of these children have to relive that in the form of taking the stand, I think would be very damaging for the rest of their lives, if it already hadn't been, based on a lot of this. So I do think we see something similar with Jodi down the line here. But you're right. Things could very well be delayed after things take place today, because what happens today directly impacts Jodi Hildebrandt.
Just to be clear, again, we haven't seen the hearing yet for Ruby Franke as we're recording this. Do you know if any representative from Jodi Hildebrandt, her lawyers, anybody is going to attend this hearing and be aware of what happened? Because I don't even know if Jodi Hildebrandt has been working around behind the scenes trying to work out a deal. If she was hit by surprise at this statement from Ruby Franke's lawyer, we haven't heard anything either. So I'd be very curious if you know if Jodi Hildebrandt, her lawyers, anybody are actually going to attend Ruby Franke's hearing today.
It's not clear if they will, but I'd have to imagine, given the connection between these two, right? The friendship, the business partner, the whatever. And the fact that Jodi's attorney has an office, relatively close to the courthouse here, I would really have to imagine that they would be sitting at least in the courtroom listening to what takes place today, or maybe they already have a heads up on how this thing's going to go if they've worked together in any way. And it's a lot of those things that we don't know because, they just don't talk about those things, right? But it's one of those things that we are waiting to see the exact paperwork on this
Right.
agreement once it is filed into the system. I do obviously have the expectation that Ruby Franke will spend more time in jail, and that this is not getting off scot-free at all because
Right.
of the admission here or whatever she's pleading forth. But I wouldn't be surprised if we did see anybody, even if it's family or something like that, related to Jodi Hildebrandt that will be there at the hearing for Ruby Franke on Monday, December 18th, coming up here as we are talking in just a few hours.
And that's what I want to kind of end the conversation on in terms of, yeah, I agree with you. I can't imagine a deal where Ruby Franke would get no time behind bars. Specifically, there was this part in her statement where it seemed that she said she would support Kevin Franke's ability to get custody of the kids. Paraphrasing a bit, and that would seem to me to suggest maybe she's not going to be around. The bigger question is what would happen with Jodi. So again, these are very serious charges. Now you have Ruby throwing Jodi under the bus, which, as we've been saying, is consistent with what we've heard from other people. If Jodi were even to enter into a deal, I would have to imagine whatever punishment she receives would be much worse than Ruby Franke. Would you agree with that?
Based on the understanding that we have for how this is going to proceed with Ruby, I would really imagine that Jodi will take the brunt of this. Based on what we've heard from, go back to Jodi Hildebrandt. I asked her directly months ago, would you say that Jodi was the mastermind between all of this? And she said yes. Based on the people that I've talked to about Jodi, all of this screams Jodi's tactics and how she has approached individuals over the years, whether it be couples that have gone to them for counseling, whether it had been somebody way back when that was referred through the church prior to things blowing up in that standpoint. I would have to imagine that if there are extra charges to give, they would likely go towards Jodi Hildebrandt based on a lot of the conversations that we've been having with people that had past experiences with her, and how Ruby does point the finger here, at least in this statement from her attorneys. It does make sense that there's kind of this uneven balance here between what has been going on. Keep in mind, the children were found at Jodi's house. So it's all these things that lean more towards Jodi in a way than they do towards Ruby, even though we do know that Ruby spent an ample amount of time in Ivins. We did see the video of her pulled over for speeding, 6 days, 5 days before all of this really shook down. She was in Ivins again. So there is that obvious connection between she was there, obviously very well knew what was going on, but I do believe all of this was spearheaded, as it seems based on people that we've talked to, by Jodi. So I would have to imagine those charges are going to be heavily levied against Jodi Hildebrandt.
And even in the police documentation, they suggested that Ruby had filmed a video with Jodi in that residence 2 days before these arrests were made. Now, I'll finish up the conversation by just saying, again, when you see this video, everybody, when you see my conversation with Brian, we will know the answer, presumably, about what Ruby Franke. But I think all of this still applies because we are most likely not going to have an answer about Jodi Hildebrandt by the end of the day. This is going to continue on. Brian, you've been doing incredible work. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk about this. For anybody who wants, up-to-date coverage of what is happening in this case, Brian Schnee, KUTV2 News. They're going to be on the ground there. Really appreciate it. The only thing is a little disappointing is that, look, we hope this case is resolved the best way it should be resolved in the interest of justice. I will say that will conclude, our conversations if this case ultimately wraps up, which is something I'd be disappointed about because I've really enjoyed having these conversations with you, Brian. But let's keep in touch. Let's find out what's happening next, and I'm sure we'll have a lot more to talk about.
Thanks as always for having me on too. I've really enjoyed these. It's an opportunity to share more of our long form conversation, a better understanding to people at home that have been following this. Maybe you don't live in Utah, you don't see our reporting every day. And we've really tried to keep people up to date on this as we've been able to find out more. Sometimes when things go into the court process, they get hidden, they get stashed away, and we just don't know. But our team, not just myself, for example, we have a team here today.
Yep.
We've tried to do the very best we can to put all of this out there for ultimately the viewer to decide and the viewer to understand however which way they'd like to look at these two women and this overall situation. But you never know. There could be always more interesting things coming out of Utah that you want to talk about. So
Yep.
just keep the number on speed dial, will you?
Well, I will. Hopefully that's not the case, because anytime we cover it, it's not
Right.
great news. So, but I hear you. Brian Schnee, thank you so much. Great talking to you as always.
Happy holidays. Thank you.
That is all we have for you right now here on Sidebar, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. Speak to you next time.